Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I just love the opportunity to share my story because it's really the story of what Christ has done. It's not really my story, it's his story. And I love, there's a t-shirt over there that says, "Let the redeemed of the Lord say so." It's one of my favorite verses, Psalm 107:2, "Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he has redeemed from the hand of the enemy." So I'm so thankful for what God has done because there is no way that I could have pulled myself up out of the horrible pit. There was no way I could rescue myself. I couldn't fix myself. Neither could my parents or anybody else that loved me. They prayed for me, and God began to rescue me. In fact, I've been asked a couple of times, not often, but I've been asked a couple of times if I would come share my story and just not mention Jesus. And it's like, I don't have a story without Jesus. What do you want me to share? You want to share how messed up I was? But no, so I'm so grateful to the Lord. I'm so thankful for all he has done. So I want to share a little bit of my story, but, and like we've talked about this weekend, there were some things in my childhood that that may have contributed to some of those beliefs, some of those lies I believed very early in life, but I didn't see any of that when I went into the lifestyle. I was absolutely convinced I was born that way. I was like, I have had these feelings my whole life. I remember being in kindergarten feeling this way. And so I didn't see any connections, but after the Lord delivered me and he began to reveal these things to me. So this is kind of in retrospect. But I actually had a very difficult relationship with my mom growing up. And, you know, I look back now, and now all of a sudden I'm a stepmom, and I'm realizing how hard parenting is. So very sorry to my mom. Actually, as God has really brought so much healing, I really have had great compassion for my mom and what she went through. She grew up under in a very difficult. Her mom was very, very sickly, and her dad, he had been in the war and just seen such horrors, I think. And she grew up under a very strict, kind of hard father, and he drug her to absolutely every kind of. He worked 3 jobs and then had many, many, many things that he was doing mission-wise and would take her along. And so she grew up just being busy nonstop and always. And it was, she had the attitude like, if you're not, if you have a moment to rest and you're not working hard enough for God. She said she felt like she was on this performance treadmill for God, trying so hard in her own flesh to earn God's favor, and it was never enough. And so as a result, a lot of times in my childhood, my mom was so stressed out and burned out, and she just had no time, no energy, and it was always like, go away, get off of me, leave me alone, go to your room, you are so annoying, just leave me alone, give me 5 minutes of peace. And, you know, I just didn't understand. I didn't understand what my mom was going through, but as a child, I felt so rejected by my mom. And I was really convinced my mom didn't love me, and my very quiet, obedient brother had a very good relationship with her. And I didn't understand the difference. I was very hyper. I had a ton of energy. And so I remember like being around, standing next to her at church one time. She's going on and on about how great my brother was. And she was talking about how annoying I was, what a handful I was. And it hurt me so much. My mom had no idea. Actually, when I started talking about this later, she had no idea how I'd felt as a child. You know, and she was, I was so close to my dad that, you know, I was getting a lot of love from my dad, but I saw God through the lens of my mother. I saw God as distant, didn't want anything to do with me. I knew I was supposed to do the right things, but I just was convinced that God didn't really want to spend time with me. He didn't love me. I mean, I knew he loved me in a sort of intellectual sense, but I didn't really know what love was. And when I was 8, I was molested by another boy, and it brought a lot of confusion. I was already so jealous of my brother. And I remember thinking, I wish that I had been a boy like my brother. My mom had miscarried 2 boys between my brother and I. And so I thought, well, maybe she wished I was one of the boys. And then when I was molested, it just brought so much confusion into the picture. When I was 14, I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome, and so my body was just not working properly. I was in constant, chronic, excruciating pain all the time, and on top of that, they were telling me I was likely never going to have children. And so I began to think, well, if God made me a girl, and I was told, you know, God doesn't make any mistakes, so if God did this on purpose, then God is a jerk, and God is just cruel. And I really tried very hard to convince myself I was an atheist, but I could not deny the Bible teaching that I had had all my life. I'd grown up not only in a Christian home, but in a Christian school, and we were there every time the door was open at church, and there was so much Bible in me I could not deny. I knew it was the truth. But so I kind of became agnostic, or just didn't really want anything to do with God. When I was 16, I told God I would never serve him again, ran away from the faith as hard as I could. I wanted to sin in every way possible. Wanted to be the opposite of a Christian, whatever that was. I began to get into some very dark things. Just never ended up really in like a satanic cult, but that's really kind of where I was headed. It's kind of a miracle, because I wanted to be just as dark and evil as possible. I remember I was listening to an Alice Cooper song talking about poison running through your veins, and I just inviting the evil into my life and wanting to be as dark as possible. There were times in high school, I remember we were involved in a play, and I was they were praying beforehand, and I didn't want anything to do with God, and I was praying to Satan, asking Satan to keep people from coming to know Jesus, because I hated him so much. I was so angry, and I had been hurt a lot too. I kept trying to look for love in all the wrong places, and so I was dating lots and lots of guys, and I was just being dumped and rejected over and over and over again. It was just fracturing my soul. I didn't understand why God's way is better. I knew what I was supposed to do. I knew I was living in sin, but I didn't understand why, and I didn't understand why I couldn't find love. And I was just being rejected so much. And I was getting deeper and deeper into sexual sin and into pornography, and it became an addiction. But instead of making me feel loved, it always made me feel empty and dirty and ashamed. And but the pornography addiction just had such a grip on me that eventually I started acting out in other ways, and I joined an adult hookup site and started having one-night stands all over the state. And I remember every time driving home was such shame. Feeling so dirty, so worthless, so used. And I kept hoping that one of them would finally want me. I would tell them, no, there's no strings attached, but I was always secretly hoping one of them would want to keep me. And one finally did, and it was the most horrible relationship of my entire life. He was an alcoholic. He was a horrible man. And I remember I stayed with him for 4 years, but the whole time I was miserable, but I didn't want to be alone. I was so desperate to not be alone and to be loved. And so eventually I kept thinking, I wish I was the man. If I was the man, I know how to treat a woman. And so I began to fantasize about this, and I began to fantasize through porn especially, and playing virtual sex games, and, trying to live out this fantasy. And it just began to get more and more of a grip on me. And finally I decided that I had to go and become a man somehow. I'd never even heard the word transgender, but this idea was taking hold of me, and I began to look it up. And I was shocked when there were thousands of other people out there that felt like this. And I found a support group in my local town. I was living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I went, and within 5 minutes, they were like, oh, you are definitely transgender. It's like, I knew it. I knew this was me. My whole life makes sense. And so I, with my whole heart, just began to pursue that with everything. And I didn't want to listen to anybody's opinion. My parents tried so desperately to help me, and I was just like, you better get on board with me or get out of my way. I don't want anything to do with you if you want to affirm this. And it was like, no relationship prior mattered. Didn't matter who it was in my life. If it all became about the affirmation. And I think this is important to understand. I hear this from so many parents. There's something about when people are embracing this trans identity, they become absolutely obsessed with it, to the point that they really don't see anything else. My entire life revolved around affirmation. And I think a lot of it is because they're constantly trying to override the truth that is so obvious. I knew every single day that I was not a man, but I wanted it so bad. Every moment of every day, I was trying to get more affirmation. I was trying to override this, and I was trying to make it real. And every little step, it seems like you're getting a little closer until you're reminded again. It's like a drug that's just never enough. And as I began to take the hormones, and my voice began to get lower, and I began to grow facial hair, and it's like, oh, this is real. This is really happening, and you kind of know it's fake, but it's like, well, one day this is going to be real, because everything, it seems to get you a little closer. And so I remember in 2009, I went to San Francisco and had an outpatient double mastectomy, had the breast removed. And I remember thinking, I was just on top of the world. This is everything I've ever wanted. The surgery made me legally male, and I was just on cloud nine until reality started hitting that the surgery hadn't made me a man. I was devastated. And I felt so stupid. I thought, even women have mastectomies for medical reasons. Like, this didn't make me a man. And I thought, well, at what point does this become real? And eventually I had all the female organs removed. I had a hysterectomy and I had an oophorectomy. I used to say all the female organs because that's how I'd always heard it described. And when I started studying male and female, like somebody mentioned yesterday, that our sex chromosomes are in every cell of our body, so all of our organs are male or female. But anyway, that's what I knew of it at the time, because I didn't want anything female left in my body. If I get rid of it all, then I will be male. But I realized that still didn't make me a man. I was so devastated. I thought, well, once I have the genital reassignment, then maybe it will be real. But there was a lot of doubt creeping in, and I was getting very nervous because I knew that I had put all my cards on this play. But I remember when I started looking at the genital reassignment surgeries, I was devastated. No one had told me how bad these surgeries are. And they really ought to call them genital mutilation surgeries. There was nothing about this surgery that was ever going to be real. I realized it was completely artificial. And on top of that, there have been so many complications. I know of one girl that was permanently in a wheelchair. I know of another one that has had 31 corrective surgeries, among many, many other problems I've heard of. And it is, I realized in horror that I was never going to be a man. I knew it was never going to be real. And it was like, well, this is the best life's ever going to get. I was kind of drifting through life and I was miserable, and I thought, there's got to be more to life than this. But it's not Christianity, because I grew up in that. That didn't have the answers. That never brought any kind of peace or fulfillment. Like, why am I here? And I started wrestling through all these things. And I was desperately searching for answers. I started filling my life with any kind of entertainment or anything I could do to keep my mind off of how miserable I was. I'd been happy for several years, and in a sense, it was still better than the pain I remembered from being female, because I'd felt like I had no worth or value as a female. I'd been treated like such trash by so many men. And I thought, well, it's still better than that. So at least everybody else thinks I'm a man. But I realized that I was still so empty. And my mom and dad had been praying along with many other people, and God had been drawing my heart over the years, little by little. And I look back, and it was like this little breadcrumb trail, God just drawing me little by little unto himself for years. God was answering the prayers behind the scenes in so many ways. I was listening to, of all things, I was transgender, listening to conservative talk radio. And so they would talk about God once in a while, and that's a bit of a long story how that happened. But God just uses such unlikely things. And so they would talk about God once in a while. And in fact, Glenn Beck had a huge influence on my life. My mom was so scared I was going to become a Mormon. But he had a huge influence on me because he was always talking about God. And it just began to soften my heart. And then as my mom was working on a website for her Bible study, and I began to read the lessons because I was just going to summarize it for the website. I didn't know this was an ambush by God. But I began to read the word, and there's a verse, one of my life verses is Psalm 107:20 that says, he sent his word to heal them and to deliver them from their destructions. And God began to use the word of God to transform my heart. And I noticed along the way that my mother had changed so much over the years. All of a sudden, my mom had peace that I had never seen in her. And she had this faith that was just, all I had known was religion growing up. But all of a sudden, there was a real faith and a real peace that I had never seen in her. And such joy. And so I began to want what my mom had, and we spent months talking about what she was learning and teaching. And one night I said, Mom, I want what you have. And I gave my life to the Lord, and I was so, honestly, I got so radically changed. I couldn't believe God would save me. I was so stunned that God would save me after all I had done. And I was going to be a man of God, and I was really excited about that. And so I remember just being, I want everything you have for me, Lord. I asked God to enlist me in his army, and I just wanted to be just completely sold out for Jesus. But God kept drawing my heart and kept pulling on me, and I knew I was not living right. I knew I was living in sin, but it was like, God, you can have everything else, but I'm not going back to being a woman. There's no way I can go back. I've had all these surgeries. I had facial hair. I had this partner I'd been with for years. And I was like, you can have everything in my life, but there's just no way to go back. And I finally was desperate, and I threw myself on the floor before the Lord one night, and I said, God, I want everything you have for me. I don't want to miss anything. What do you want from me? And I'm thinking, like he wanted me to go be a missionary or do all these other things. I was thinking of a checklist he would give me so I would be good with him. And he asked me a question. He said, if you stood before me tonight, what name would I call? And I said, oh, God, that is not fair. That's kind of and I knew he was not going to call me Jake. I had been hearing him in my prayers. When I would talk to the Lord, I was hearing him call me Laura. And I said, God, that's not fair. I've repented of this. I said I was sorry, but there's nothing I can do about it now. I can't go back. And he reminded me of John chapter 1, where it says, Jesus Christ himself is the creator. He said, you cannot claim to love me and yet reject my creation. And I thought I was being condemned because I was not going to go back to being female. I was like, God, that's just not an option. But in the most loving voice I've ever heard in all my life, he whispered to me, and he said, let me tell you who you are. And that's what began to free me, but that was just the very beginning. I did not want to come out of it. I just thought I was absolutely going to die. In fact, I really began to believe that it was better for me to just die. In fact, I found graffiti on a building where near the place where I went to get my hair done before my wedding, and it said, death before detransition. And I used to believe that. And in fact, there was a couple of months where I begged the Lord to take my life because I didn't see any way out. But I knew that God was calling me to something more. And I thought, God, there is no way I can do this. But as I began to, and I finally saw myself in this deep, dark pit I couldn't get out of. And I could see the light at the top, but there was no way out. He reminded me of the verse that says in Matthew 16, if anyone will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life from my sake shall find it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his own soul? Or what shall he give in exchange for his soul? And I had a clear vision of Jesus Christ getting down on one knee. He reached his hand down in this pit, and he said, do you trust me? And I knew he was asking me to walk away from everything. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done. I honestly thought I was going to be miserable the rest of my life. But I knew what he promised me, that I would have a redeemed body. I knew that one day I would no longer have a sin nature, and I knew it would be okay. And I thought, okay, I can deny this for the rest of my life. I know it will be okay one day. And so I agreed with the Lord. I walked away from it all. And honestly, I was so miserable. I cried and cried. It was so painful. But as God began to peel away the layers of the onion, he didn't tell me how he was going to work all this out. And I didn't like instantly have this love of being a woman. But it was like little by little, these steps, as I began to forgive my mother, as I began to forgive other girls that had hurt me, as I began to forgive the men that had hurt me. God began to peel away these layers. And it's like, it's not like he recreated this girl. I realized eventually I was the girl all along. It was just buried under so much pain. There's a verse in Hebrews 12, 15, and 16 that the Lord reminded me recently. It says, looking diligently, lest any man fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. There shall be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. And the Lord has shown me this connection between unforgiveness, bitterness, anger, and all sexual sin, defilement. It always leads us away from the Lord. So if you're struggling, if you're still, and it may not be this, there are other things that God works on, but this is a profound key point, I think, that there is often bitterness and unforgiveness deep in the roots of this. And yes, like me, you may have been very hurt. Sometimes I've heard of such horrible abuse I can't even imagine. And yet Jesus calls us all to forgive. Just as he on the cross, as he died, as he was being nailed to the cross by those he loved so much. And what did he say? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And God can give us that forgiveness for others when we don't have it in ourselves. But I just want to encourage anybody that's out there to let go of the bitter roots, to let God clean those things out. And it's a step-by-step process. It wasn't all at once. But as God peeled away those layers and I began to, this flower sort of began to emerge, and I began to, okay, now I'm a little comfortable being in women's clothes. This is okay. And now it's not so bad being called a woman. And, little by little, and eventually I started to really love being a woman. And then God has brought this amazing man into my life that I'm so thrilled. I knew God had a husband for me, but I had such low expectations of God. I thought, God is going to bring me some man that, I'm just going to have to learn to love, and, it's going to be just... He has brought me such an amazing, Christ-like, godly man that I wish he was here. This is my first time away from him since getting married, so a little sad. I really miss him, and I wish he was here, that you could meet him. He is just a great man. So I'm so thankful to the Lord for the redemption of my life, and I pray that for each and every one of you and for those you love.